And welcome to Devil Dash here on Dash Sports TV. I'm Wills Rice, joined by Josh Eyraud. Here we talk all things ASU. Today we're doing a little emphasis on ASU football and how the recruiting has really evolved over the past couple years under Herm Edwards. And the first thing we're going to get into is how ASU really is a powerhouse in the Pac-12. And I know a lot of you may be scratching your head, but is ASU a powerhouse in the Pac-12?
I mean, they're certainly on the rise. The past couple of years, they've been doing better. So, yes and no. I'm going to go with no. I mean, we're slowly on the rise. Oregon, better to staple I like to look at recruiting in the Pac-12. Mario Cristobal does a great job up there. I'm not sure about Utah, but they might be on the rise. They've had a pretty good program last year. What do you think, Wills?
I mean, Oregon, we've seen years and years of Oregon dominating the Pac-12. Up there with USC. But Utah's a really interesting one. I mean, they're losing their starting quarterback and starting running back. But, again, they weren't really known for their offense last year. That defense is what really held them down. This year, I think they were ranked 18 or 17 in the preseason polls today. So, the nation's giving some respect out to the Utes. But when you pull up the recruiting classes, I mean, since Herm Edwards has came onto campus, ASU has dominated the Pac-12 South. I mean, last year they were second in Pac-12 recruiting, only to USC, which I feel like a lot of ASU fans can kind of say, okay, that's fair. But then you go to this year, the 2020 recruiting class. ASU is number 4 in the Pac-12, only behind Washington, Oregon, and Stanford. And I don't know, the big thing with ASU is we could never get those in-state recruits, and we're still not. But the thing is, we're getting those good out-of-state recruits. And I think that ASU is turning into that destination of I want to come here to compete for Pac-12 championships and beyond that. But you bring up Oregon, you bring up Utah. I mean, I don't know how long Utah can sustain a long-term program in this Pac-12 with USC and ASU kind of taking over the Pac-12 South and Oregon and Washington just always reloading no matter. I mean, look at Washington. They lost their coach. They lost their starting quarterback to the NFL. It's like every year you feel like they're going to compete in the North. But what are some reasons do you think ASU hasn't been a Pac-12 powerhouse for recruiting? And what are some things do you think they could help to get them there?
Well, I think Herm Edwards is still a little young in his coaching career. I mean, he's probably, 5 years in, 4 years
I think this is his third or fourth year. But, I mean, you do have to remember he coached forever before joining ESPN. He was an NFL coach and a college coach. Not a very successful one, I might add, but he did take a large gap at ESPN.
Yeah, and then the NFL, there's going to be major differences between coaching full-grown NFL players, guys who have been in the league for a while, between young college players, freshmen in college. It's a lot on a player, especially when you're a full-time athlete. But I don't know. I think ASU's done a good job this year with getting to the recruits in California, especially Antonio Pierce is huge credit to that. He's active on socials, mostly Twitter. But Oregon right now is still top dog in the recruiting class.
I mean, I don't know if we'll ever see a day where when it comes to recruiting rankings that Oregon is really knocked off, maybe number 2 or 3 in the Pac-12, but they're never going to have a bottom 6 class. The thing with ASU that I think is amazing is Antonio Pierce. It's a great name. He was a New York Giants linebacker. I believe he won a Super Bowl there, so he has that pedigree of winning. And we mentioned it last week with Marvin Lewis and other names like that, the pedigree of just NFL-style coaches. Antonio Pierce, if you follow him on Twitter, he acts like a child. He acts like a college student. But the thing is, his recruiting antics on Twitter get these kids hyped. They get these kids to want to be a part of this program. And I think every year that Clay Helton is the head coach at USC, I think that's another great recruiting year for ASU. Look what they did this year. I believe USC was 10th in the Pac-12 for recruiting. And, I mean, wow. I don't care if you have Ray Charles as your coach and you can't see who's his recruiting, but you, as USC, you should never be number 10 in the Pac-12 for recruiting.
UCLA finished above them.
Yeah. And the fact that Clay Helton has retained his job, I mean, is incredible. And the ASU is every year it seems like they have this opportunity. You look at the Pac-12 South. I mean, Utah was this close to making the college football playoff this year, but it's ASU has this opportunity where no one is dominating the Pac-12 South. USC's done it for years. UCLA, they've had some good teams. U of A's even had some good teams. this is the time to continuously build that recruiting class where you can build that program to take over the Pac-12 for years to come, to build that, not necessarily national championship dynasty. I'm going to pump the brakes there for ASU fans, but a team that can compete in the Pac-12 and is in the top 25 every year. We go to a school that's the biggest population-wise for undergrad in the country. Is it too hard to ask for to have a top 25 school program? I mean, a kicker that can kick, a punter that can punt. The little things that ASU has lacked for years is something that Herm Edwards has come and is really just – he's tied over every loose end and made sure that ASU is a committed program to winning on and off the field.
Yeah, I think the Sun Devils have a chance to get there in a couple of years. I mean, Herm Edwards is the guy to do it. But right now, Oregon is just they're too stacked right now. I mean, just look at their 2020 class. They got 3 5-star recruits. The Sun Devils don't have any of them. They're bringing back a defense that finished second in the country with 20 interceptions. I mean, they just got another Dante Manning, number 3 ranked cornerback in the Pac-12, joins them. I mean, they're going to be on the top for maybe another 3 years, and it's going to be tough for Herm and the Sun Devils to break that.
So you mentioned that, these rankings are obviously big. And, I mean, look what happened this year. ASU beat Oregon. Put us on a neutral site field. Get us into that game, and you never know what could happen. I mean, even though we got whooped by Stanford at home the last time that we were in the Pac-12 championship game, but just as a fan to get to that game, it would be something incredible. But Herm this year, what he's done different from recruiting classes in the past is I think we've gone after big-name targets. We've gone after big-name recruits, the Vontaze Burfict, the DJ Fosters. We've gotten a few of them. But the thing that I love about this year's class is that Herm went out and got a position of need. We lost N'Keal Harry. We lost Brandon Ayuk. He went out and got 3 stud. I mean, they're not nationally recruited wide receivers, but a Chad Johnson Jr. where you're going to get that name onto campus where other players might want to play with him. I mean, you just get these players that make your team better. It might not be the highest recruiting class, but I think those are players that are going to come in day one and impact how the Sun Devils play on the field. And I think that's the way of building that recruiting powerhouse. It's not necessarily having the number 1, number 2 recruits, but when you are, I guess, a smaller dog, I'll say for Pac-12 football, is to get the positions of need that you can build a better team around. And once you have that consistent top 25 team, then you can go after the 5-star recruits. And that's what Oregon's established. I mean, Oregon's established that they can compete every single year. And that's why we talked about, is ASU a powerhouse now? I think yes. Yeah. I really do think yes. I mean, they are dominating recruiting. They really are. And they're winning defensively, and they're showing that they don't need Jaden Daniels is a fantastic player, but they don't need him to throw for 500 yards to win games. Benjamin carried games. Jaden carried games. We've seen the defense have some big games like against Florida State in the bowl game. It's a little bit of everything in different games. It reminds me of a basketball team without a superstar, kind of like the Toronto Raptors. Pascal Siakam's great, but it's someone every different night that gets it done. And now they've kind of established that winning culture. And it's something that I think Arizona sports in general has lacked for a really long time. And that bringing someone like Herm Edwards into the mix has been an absolute difference maker. And it's shown, it really has.
Yeah, and you got to remember, too, at the end of the day, it's got to all come together under Herm Edwards' plan along with the other coaches. I mean, last year ASU dropped a game to Colorado and UCLA. So, there's still going to be those games. You can have the best recruiting class. Oregon lost to ASU. I mean, there's still going to be those games where everyone's not on their A game, and ASU could lose those potentially really important games down the stretch.
Yeah, and you got to remember these are the kids, the freshmen that walk onto campus. I mean, unless they're JUCO transfers, are 18 years old. I mean, we have such high expectations for these true freshman quarterbacks that come onto campus and lead these massive university fan bases to. We saw Keaton Slovis in the Pac-12. We saw Jaden Daniels. We saw Sam Howell. We touched on these guys last week, but the amount of expectations they have for an 18-year-old kid, I think, is incredible. And the fact that they're level-headed enough to handle that and to exceed those expectations is something that's said about every coaching staff. And I know we bag on USC here, but I mean, Keaton Slovis had a fantastic freshman year. And that was someone that wasn't even recruited very highly. I believe he was a 3-star recruit. So, I mean, we talked about ASU's wide receivers that are incoming. So I want to shift gears a little bit, but stay on the wide receiver topic. We've seen, some great NFL wide receivers, some young guys, the Odell Beckham Jr.'s, the Jarvis Landry's, but USC fans are so staunch on being wide receiver U. Do you think wide receiver U is still belongs to USC?
I mean, they've got a nice resume. I'll give them that.
Their resume is fantastic. I'll read off some of the names. So the teams that I took into account for wide receiver U were LSU, Miami, Ohio State, and USC. For all time, I'll read some names that USC's had. Keyshawn Johnson, fantastic name. Lynn Swann, Johnny Morton, Curtis Conway, all great names. Let me tell you what they've done for us lately. We have Juju Smith-Schuster, who had a great rookie year. Everyone was ready for him to take over the throne. Look what happens when he doesn't have Antonio Brown. He went 42 catches for 552 yards this year. He played all 16 games. Does that sound like someone who's even ready to be a number 2 receiver? So that's one. Nelson Aguilar is known to have the worst hands in all of NFL. He can't catch a brick if you just tossed it to him from a foot away. Deontay Burnett was a major disappointment from a few years ago. I believe he was one of the highly touted wide receivers coming into his last year at USC, and I believe he went undrafted. And then Robert Woods has been a productive wide receiver, but I also want to say a letdown in the NFL where, we've seen the Rams go out and get all these wide receivers and do nothing with them. And I think we're starting to see a trend here for these USC style wide receivers. I mean, they have so much promise with Michael Pittman on the Colts. He's supposed to be a game changer for Phillip Rivers next year, but I don't think USC's been wide receiver U. I don't think they are wide receiver U, and I don't think they're even wide receiver U in the Pac-12 right now. Right now, I want to say that history-wise, yes, obviously, but over the last 5 to 10 years, I would like to say USC is not. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, USC still has some really good wide receivers right now. I mean, their core, look at it. Amon-Ra, St. Brown, he's a good junior playing from right now. Tyler Vaughn. I mean, first thing, look at Amon-Ra. He's one of the first. He's a true freshman that led the Trojans into a season receptions, and only other people to do that were Mike Williams, Dwayne Jarrett, and Robert Woods, all first rounders taken for USC. I think that's a good testament to the wide receiver U statement coming out of USC.
Okay, so let me name you some names from other schools. LSU. These were just some ones I did off the top of my head. Odell Beckham Jr., Jarvis Landry, and Brandon LaFell. Those are some pretty great names. Miami had Santana Moss, Reggie Wayne, Andre Johnson, and Devin Hester. Okay? So far, I would take both of those over USC. Ohio State had Ted Ginn Jr., Tony Gonzalez. I know he's a tight end, but I threw him in here because he's one of the greatest ever. Michael Thomas and Terry McLaurin for Ohio State. I mean, when you look at those names, USC had Keyshawn Johnson, but those other players are all they were all top 3 to 7 wide receivers in the NFL, maybe besides Brandon LaFell. But some of those other names between Miami and LSU and Ohio State have been premier names in the NFL for a while, and they succeeded in college. I know I talked about this off air, but people were asking if wide receiver U is what they did in college or once they got drafted. So the reason I say USC is no longer wide receiver U is look at what ASU has been doing with wide receivers. I mean, when you say these names, N'Keal Harry, everyone from Arizona knows him because he went to Arizona, played Arizona high school football here, and dominated in track and football and basketball. We have Brandon Ayuk, who is a pretty highly touted first-round draft pick by the San Francisco 49ers, and he's going to get a lot of playing time this year. That's back-to-back first-round draft picks for the Sun Devils, and we have up and coming these new freshmen coming in that get to work with Jaden Daniels, and I think it's something to really look out for. But what do you think about ASU kind of creeping on USC's tails for that wide receiver U title in the Pac-12?
I hear where you're coming from, and I like it. I mean, N'Keal Harry, he's a good prospect. Tom Brady ain't going to be throwing to him anymore up in New England, but Brandon Ayuk, really promising young star. I mean, we'll see what Chad Johnson Jr. does at ASU. I mean, he's going to be an exciting player to watch. Jaden Daniels throwing to him. I know Herm is going to draw up a good play or two for him, and there'll be some highlights throughout the year, but we'll see how it affects a wide receiver you on around.
So I want to bring up. I know a lot of people will be like, okay, those are two first rounders in the last 2 years, but where's the overall resume? So I know I threw Tony Gonzalez into the first argument for Ohio State, so I decided to do the same for ASU because these two names are also great. We have Todd Heap and Zach Miller, two great tight ends that came out of Arizona State. But I think a name that people forget because he played in the 50s or 60s was Charlie Taylor from ASU. I just want to read some of his stats. He was an All-American twice in college. He was named to the Pro Bowl 8 times in the NFL. And during his NFL career, he recorded 90 touchdowns for 9,110 yards on 648 receptions. Oh, and yeah, he's a Pro Football Hall of Famer, and he was named to the NFL 1960s All-Decade Team. So, I mean, ASU definitely has some of those big names in the past and in the front. We got a question from Jason Marks. Is wide receiver U still a Pac-12 school, or has it shifted conferences? Josh, I'll let you take that one. What do you think?
I mean, there's a very possible chance that it could switch conferences. I mean, look at Clemson. Look at the receivers they've had the past 2 to 3 years. I mean,
not even last 2 to 3 years. I mean, they've had Hopkins, who's arguably the best wide receiver in the NFL right now besides Michael Thompson. Sorry to cut you off, but keep going.
Yeah, and I think you had some good stats on some Miami wide receivers as well.
Yeah, to answer your question, Jason, I think wide receiver U being in conference or out of conference, it really depends on what you define wide receiver U as. I was talking to our producer off the air about this. Is it what they did in college? Is it where they got drafted and it stops there from their college to the draft? Or is it when they walk on campus freshman year to when they retire in the NFL? Because I think if it's when they retire in the NFL, I don't think USC's ever had the rightful claim to it. I think it's far and wide Miami. I mean, some of the names that Miami's produced out of there, I know they haven't had a lot recently, and that's been part of my argument. But I think if you're being realistic, as my definition would be from freshman year of college to when they retire in the NFL of judging a wide receiver, I don't think it's ever been a Pac-12 school. I think USC's definitely been close with quarterbacks, wide receivers, and DBs, but I just don't think that the Pac-12, if you put up those top names against top names, I don't think we weigh up against those other schools. I really don't. What do you think?
For a little bit, but
maybe for 1 or 2 names. But when you start going down these lists, of Clemson, Ohio State, Miami, it's just you start comparing guys like Robert Woods to a guy like not necessarily DeAndre Hopkins, but it's Andre Johnson. Let's say Robert Woods to Andre Johnson. It's not a fair comparison. I'm sorry, it's just the top of my head, first thing that came to mind, but.
There's just not enough talent that goes to the Pac-12 compared to the SEC and the ACC.
I will give USC credit when it comes to a lot of their guys are up and coming guys. Juju's only played 2 years. Pittman's hasn't even played a snap in the NFL yet. But the big thing is USC hasn't done a lot in the past 5-6 years with wide receiver wise. I mean, Marquise Lee was another bust. We've seen wide receiver after wide receiver that comes out of there is a bust. And I question if NFL GMs are drafting USC wide receivers because of the history they've had of being successful in the NFL. That's a serious question I have. I mean, it could be way off. It could play a tiny little part into it. But I think it's interesting to look at the success that USC wide receivers have had recently.
Well, and to counter that, the Juju stat you threw up at the beginning of the segment, you know who was throwing to him?
Look at their record. They competed for the playoffs all the way into the last game of the season. I want to say they won 8 or 9 games.
Yeah, their defense stepped up to the plate.
I agree, but what I'm saying is when you're starting quarterbacks out, you need your star wide receiver. I don't care if it's Kyler Murray throwing in the ball or John Skelton, but DeAndre Hopkins better damn well get above 552 yards this year. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, I mean, look, Mike Tomlin made an adjustment. Ben Roethlisberger, when Ben Roethlisberger was throwing to him, was he a Pro Bowler? I'm sure he was. He was amazing. I mean, Juju's going to have another good year. The whole fallout with AB, I'm sure that got to him.
I think the 2 biggest question marks with Juju, and Juju really could single-handedly just ignite the fire of wide receiver U. Just kind of keep it lit, just kind of keep it going until the next few guys step in there. But the big questions with whether Juju can be successful are, how healthy is Ben Roethlisberger? This guy's getting old. Can he still compete for a championship? And B, is last year's season, because of the quarterbacks, or is it because he's now being guarded by the number one cornerback on every team? Yeah. So it's something to look forward to. But we're talking about wide receivers and how, the incoming freshmen can be affected by COVID. Which team do you think, looking at the Pac-12, is going to take the biggest hit from a Pac-12 canceled season?
I mean, it's tough to make one judgment call on a single Pac-12 school. Every different school has a different set of problems among COVID and whatnot. But I mean, just recently looking at it, I think Stanford might have taken the biggest hit. They just cut 11 varsity sports in order to save $70 million. I mean, that's just the first step in their process of looking forward, and because they're saying they overextended themselves, and what could happen next?
The big deal about Stanford cutting this, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but do you know who has the most national championships of all time across every sport? Stanford, that is correct. Which I actually found that out probably a year ago, and I was blown away by that. Like, how is it not USC or UCLA when UCLA was winning basketball championships? It felt like every year. But Stanford it's crazy that they're cutting 11 sports. I mean, it's terrible to see. Because obviously football and basketball make the majority of their money, and Stanford women's and men's soccer are both fantastic, competing for national championships. But these are the players on the football team are no more of players than the swimmers on the swim team. You really got to feel for those people, and just because of something that's completely out of their control, and it's just really heartbreaking to see. But when you talk about the teams that take the biggest hit for this football season, I have two in mind. I know we've touched on these two teams a lot. One's ASU because they have a rising star, Jaden Daniels. The other is USC. They have the exact same situation. They have a quarterback that's very likely going to be a top 10 draft pick in not this year, but next year. And they have a lot of hope for what can be a Pac-12 run this year, which is now gone. ASU and USC are in the same situation where they have sophomore quarterbacks that are both going to go in the first round after 3 years. They're both going to leave a year early, most likely, barring injuries. And the reason I say ASU is because ASU actually, I don't think Clay Helton's the coach going forward for USC, and I think USC fans admit that. They're just kind of waiting for, either a good year or, a bad year to get him out of there, and then maybe they can go after an Urban Meyer. But this year, I think, is a bigger hit for USC than ASU because Clay Helton gets another year. He gets another recruiting class. That's a big issue for USC. Do you really trust this man who just finished, I believe, 10th in the Pac-12 recruiting, to lead your team, who literally at school can recruit on its own? You don't need someone to recruit to LA. They have Hollywood. They have everything there, the weather, the beaches. I think USC is really, really taking a big hit from this canceled football season. We've seen Utah, we've seen Oregon, but, those are things that I think they have a lot of, plug-in players that can kind of fill in a lot of places because their schemes are so good. And I think Oregon's just talented from top to bottom. But I really think USC is going to take a big hit if they have another bad recruiting class up and coming, then I think it could be difficult. Where ASU, I think it definitely sucks that you're losing a year of Jaden Daniels, and I think it's the same for Keaton Slovis with USC. But with ASU, we had a fantastic recruiting class. We get to see these guys come in and play with us for practice for this year, and maybe some of them are early enroll. But then you can go out next year and really see what holes you need. Whereas USC, I know they had a number 10 ranked recruiting class, but I know they hit on some big holes in their offense, on their offensive line and other things. Actually took a offensive tackle out of my high school. But besides the point, besides Stanford cutting sports, what specific players around the Pac-12 do you think are being hurt? Maybe outside of Jaden Daniels and Keaton Slovis, but maybe is it the quarterback who's filling in for Washington and Oregon, for those two big name players that they're not going to get that season, that chance now that they might have, and those teams might go after another quarterback. Who do you think? Give me some names to look out for.
I mean, whoever's filling Jacob Eason's shoes, that's got to be tough for him. I mean, he's losing his first year of eligibility and playing time in that program, and there's going to be in everyone's first year, there's going to be a little bit of leniency of how you're performing, new program. Butterfield for sure. Same thing as the replacement. I mean, I feel bad for Kayvon Thibodeau too. I mean, that guy is for sure going to be an NFL. He's an NFL ready player right now.
Absolutely.
And just losing like a step in his development, him gaining all that experience on the defensive end. I mean, things like that just can really affect the players' like pro development.
We talked about, taking the biggest hit. What teams do you think have the most to gain for maybe taking? Obviously, none of these teams, if you asked any of them, would want to take the year off. But which team do you think would have the most to gain from a year off? A fall off and then in the spring. My apologies.
Maybe USC or ASU.
Really?
I feel like ASU is good because Jaden can get some more weight on and just get better on his feet.
So I really disagree with that because when you have ASU, you have this quarterback of, man, we've seen Manny Wilkins, the quarterback before Jane Daniels, and he was just a check down after check down after sack after check down. And to have someone like Jane Daniels is fantastic, but I think just losing, when I say ASU and USC are the two biggest losers in this, is because they're losing a year of this quarterback that can put them single-handedly in the national spotlight. We saw what Jaden Daniels did against Oregon. We've seen Keaton Slovis come to Tempe and throw for 500 yards. Those are specific players that you can get a primetime game. You really can.
Chat. I think we have a question in the chat.
Do you think these players should transfer or stick it out with their schools? Man, Jason, that's another great question. I think it really depends on your situation. I mean, if you're building something at ASU, if you're building something at USC and you believe in their coaching staff and you believe that you truly have a chance to win, I think Pac-12 is so interesting because, as we mentioned at the beginning of the show, it is so wide open. Like, Oregon's definitely the head-on favorite, and Washington's probably close behind that with, maybe Utah and USC back there. But anyone can win this. I really emphasize that. Anyone can win the Pac-12. So I think players in the Pac-12 should really stick it out. Big Ten, I really don't know. It's until we really see it take place and see the consequences or the benefits of it happening, I think it's really it has to be left unsaid because who are we to know what's going to happen out of that? What do you think?
I'm going to go ahead and disagree with you. I think that these players should take a look at the future. I mean, especially just look at the situation we're in right now. Just take a look at it this singular season. COVID happens. They're giving you a free year of eligibility. I mean, look at the draft. Look at these other Big Ten schools, SEC schools. Go there, get better with better teammates, better coaching. That's subjective, but I mean, think about that. Think about how much better that would be in the long term instead of like building a culture. Say ASU.
But let's say you're a junior this year. This is just a hypothetical for you. This is a lot of what ifs. Let's say you're a junior this year. The NCAA already announced that you can play this year and not even lose an eligibility year. Let's say you want to go pro. Do you leave your school to go transfer? Let's say you're on ASU. Let's say you transfer from ASU to Alabama. You're a junior. You've spent 2 years with this ASU squad. Do you think Alabama's just going to accept you and start you right away? I mean, depending on who it is, I don't know if there's anyone on ASU's roster. I don't know if there's anyone on ASU's roster that would start for Alabama. But that's my question is some of these teams have already been, they already have their vision of what they want to do to move forward. So how would they welcome people with open arms to just, kind of an outsider to their group, especially if you're on Ohio State? Who would want them to come to their school in the SEC? I doubt anyone wants that on their SEC school. So it's definitely something to keep an eye out for. But as we close out our show, do you have any last remarks on ASU recruiting, Herm Edwards, or just the team in general?
No, I think we pretty much covered it all right there.
The last thing I want to say with this canceled season is I think obviously no one wants to have the canceled season. We all want to play football, but I think we're missing out on a great Pac-12 season. Like I said, it's so open that I think we would have seen the Oregon States beating a Washington or an ASU beating an Oregon again, or just any of those things that really shake up football and make it interesting. But we'll have to wait till the spring to see all that. We want to thank you for joining us here today on Devil Dash. You can follow us on social media at Dash Sports TV on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, pretty much everything there is out there. go follow us. If you want to hit up our website is www.sports.tv. I'm Wills. Josh, we want to thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Next Monday.